Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically, from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Correllian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don, and as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can communicate with me directly by typing your comments or questions into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and they will show up in my chat room, and we will talk directly. And I love that aspect of this broadcast, and I find it one of the highlights of my day. So today we're going to continue our conversations about death and the spirit world and the ancestors. And my blurb for today talks about talking about building a personal relationship with guides or ancestors, and how many pagans look at death differently than people from some other world religions. And I thought I would actually take this in reverse order, because I've often read about how people deal with death, and though I'm sure there's a lot of truth in that, not all people are the same, particularly when they have religious and cultural differences, and it makes no account for that. It is often not dealt the way people look at death is not dealt with how I have looked at death. And hello to Calvin in the chat room. It's good to see you, Calvin. And again, and I've said this a couple of times this week, I've had several incidents in my life where I came very close to leaving this world. And so I've dealt with that idea of imminent death, and not at all in the same way that that people describe. And I attribute that to my different philosophy. I think about my mother and her attitude as the end of her life was coming. She was dying of cancer. There was no question that it was going to happen at that point. And there was a very different attitude. And part of that is because when you work with spirits, when you work with the ancestors, one of the things that you don't have is the same fear of death that many other people have. That we were having a conversation, I think, in my weekly chat room, and there was a story told about a famous author who was asked if he believed in magic, and he said, "No, I don't believe in magic." And the pagan audience were quite shocked by this, and he said, "I know that magic exists. I don't have to believe in it." And he pointed out that this is the same as gravity, that you don't believe in gravity, you know that gravity exists. When you work with the spirits, when you work with the idea of crossing between the worlds on a regular basis, you don't really have the same questions that someone who doesn't have these experiences has. Hello to Lynn in the chat room. Good to see you, Lynn. You have a certain knowledge of it. Now, there are always going to be some questions. I mean, one of the questions that I have is, how is that existence different from this existence? I certainly don't absolutely know, but everything I've been told, including from those who are there, and other people doing this kind of work, is that at least initially it feels very much the same, except in much more of an astral sort of way, that things can be done quite instantly that here require work to do. There they simply come into being, which is quite interesting. But when we talk about how that world differs from this one, that's one of the primary things that that I have always understood. Another thing um, is I've always understood that time does not exist there in the same way it exists here. So, I mean, how will we experience that? Well, I don't know. I figure I'll find out soon enough. But is there, in fact, an afterlife? I've seen far too much evidence of that in my own personal life to have any real questions. So when I consider, well, earlier this year, when I was having my cardiac event, um, and I was debating, do I want to live through this? There were several reasons I decided that I did at that time, but fear of death was not one of them. I knew perfectly well what basically awaits after this life has ended. I've seen it many times. I've seen it through my personal experiences. I've also read other people's accounts. I've worked with people in past life regressions where we sometimes deal with this issue. I've talked to so many spirits that whatever else, I do not have a question about that. And hello to Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. And I seem to have acquired a small friend in this room, but we had the door open because it was so beautiful last night that must have come in at that time. And I have to say, after how hot this summer has been, the fact that we've moved into cooler weather is very refreshing. But when I look at death, when I look at my attitudes toward death, they're definitely not anything like what I hear many people from other religious backgrounds talk about. Give me one moment. And I'm back. But when I look at my feelings toward death, one of the things that I think of are my experiences dealing with it my whole life. Hello to Rev Melanie in the chat room. It's good to see you. Congratulations on your degree. And Mary says, nothing like an office nap to liven up the broadcast. Absolutely. What I did is I turned on the fan, hopefully to prevent any further disruption. But, you hear people from certain other backgrounds say, well, nobody's ever come back to tell us what's there. Not in my background. In my background, people come back all the time to tell us what's there. And not just my background, but the background of a number of world religions. Hello to Christine in the chat room. It's good to see you, Christine. The idea of not knowing what's there does not go with either my philosophy or my experiences. This is, again, a very important point, that we're not just talking about philosophy, but about experiences. That it's not what you believe, but what you know. Same with magic. I know magic works. I've done it far too many times to question it. And, occasionally it works better than others. There can be any number of reasons for that. But the question of whether it works really has not entered my head for a very long time, because I simply have done it too much. I know. I've talked to too many spirits to question. Most of the things I say about death, I've had too many experiences. When I talk about spirits caught between the worlds, I've worked with many of them. As I say, I have the point of view at this point that in some cases it's only a small part of their spirit and the rest has moved forward, but still, that part is still stuck there and must be helped across. When I talk about the idea there's nothing waiting to harm you on the other side of the veil, that's based on years of experience. It's based on what I've been told by people who are there. And to question those experiences I would have to be totally paranoid, um, and literally question my experiences. Um, so when I look at death, when I think many pagans look at death, we're seeing it very differently. One of the things I talk about sometimes is that when my mother died, Lady Crystal was supposed to do her funeral. Um, but by the time we came to that day, Lady Crystal was unable to do it. She was overcome with emotion. I led my mother's funeral, and I did it as a service to her spirit, and I kept control of myself to do that. Um, but I was able to do that because I knew she was in a good place, um, and having that good send off would be important to her. Very different point of view than from certain other religions. Now, having talked about that, we also wanted to talk about how you build the kind of relationship that I'm talking about, that I've had these experiences through. And the answer to that, the first answer, of course, is that there's more than one way. There's always more than one way. Um, but what I learned to do is what I'll speak to. And what I learned to do to build a relationship with an ancestor, or the ancestors, or a spirit guide who might not technically be an ancestor, what you want to do is first make a regular offering to them. I was taught to do it daily, but it could be less often if it needed to be. And um, the offering can be very, very simple. It can be very formal if you like, but it doesn't need to be. Simplest offering of all is just to light a candle, or just to approach the altar and speak to them. And the altar doesn't have to look like an altar to be effective. An altar is a place where we focus our energies. So when we have an altar to our spirit guides, if it's in a place where there are lots of people who don't share your beliefs, it doesn't have to look like an altar to them. It can be a photo of your ancestor. It can be anything that represents ancestors to you, or just an empty space dedicated to this purpose. But you want to make that regular offering. It can be as simple as taking the time to acknowledge them, or you could light a candle, or you could offer things like flour and water or other symbolic offerings. And they are always symbolic offerings because they don't need us to feed them. If they did, they'd all be starving for the most part. And they would let us know that. But they do enjoy the exchange of energy. So, giving them something that they particularly liked, a cup of coffee, if they were coffee drinkers, for example. I mean, when I'm gone, if you want to make an offering to me, a nice cup of coffee with milk in it would be the perfect offering to me, because it was one of my favorite things. But make sure that you know what they like if you're going to do that. If you're celebrating an anniversary of their becoming an ancestor, or an anniversary of their birth date, giving them their favorite meal, just a little bit of it. It doesn't have to be enough to feed a person, because they're only taking the spiritual essence of it and really taking the gesture of it. But these are ways you can make an offering. So you make your offering, preferably daily, preferably at the same time each day. And I think that's more for us than for them. But I was told that the more you can keep it regular, the better off you are in developing stages. Later, it's less important. And then when you've made your offering and you talk to them, you tell them, I want to build this relationship. I want to be able to get messages from you. I want to work with you. Then you sit. You don't literally have to sit, but most people do. And you prepare yourself to receive those messages. And how do you do that? It's difficult to explain if you have not experienced it. Many of these things are. And the thing that's difficult is that it's so simple that it's hard to explain because it seems more complex. A lot of people will say you still your brain, but you cannot still your brain. That doesn't happen. What you want to do instead is you don't focus on anything. It's not that nothing's going to come into your brain, and very much like using a pen, um, you can't. And I've received a message on how much astral coffee I'm later going to have to deal with. I think I can do. I think I can do that, considering how much I had during this life. But it's like if you think of a cloud crossing the sky, and you just let it cross. Anything that comes into your brain, you let it do that. You don't react to it. If you react to it, you stop the process. You take note of it, but you don't react to it. One of the conversations I've had a lot in recent times has been that one of my greatest strengths and one of my greatest weaknesses were the same, and that's true for almost everyone. And it was being so very passive. But to be a good channel, to be a good medium, you have to be very passive. You have to let it come to you. If you try to bring it, you're going to warp it. If you react to it as it comes through, you're going to warp it. You have to let it come through. And then you write it down, or if you have someone you're working with, you say it out loud. You can try recording it. I found that after a certain point that may not be successful because this kind of energy can sometimes interrupt electronics. But I have gone sometimes for years without a problem recording it, depending on exactly what was coming through. But some way you must record the message because you may not remember it when you're done. In fact, most likely you won't. But if you've written it down or said it out loud or what have you, it will be there for you. And when you're done, you can go back and analyze it to your heart's content. But you never do that while you're bringing it through. You have to be a blank slate. Things will come through. That's how you get the messages. We were talking the other day about how you can tell the difference between imagination and an actual psychic message. And the answer is, when you begin, you can't. You just have to write it down and see how. And you want to go by your track record after doing this a few times to see what how well you're bringing it through. And in my experience, and with most people I've worked with, you'll quickly find that you are in fact bringing through things you could not have known, things you would not have thought. And they will find ways to make sure that they're telling you things that fit those definitions, so that you will know you're getting real messages. Events that are about to happen that you're not expecting. If you get a message telling you that an event you're not expecting is about to happen and then it happens, you know that was an accurate message. Then you can start to tell the difference in feeling between something that's just imagination and an actual message, because you'll know when you've had those accurate messages. In my experience, if you can be that blank slate, this will be true from the start. But if you're reacting to what you get, it will take you longer to develop it. And that is how you learn to receive these messages, and then practice. Now, when I was learning, Lady Crystal used a number of techniques to make it a little bit easier for me. One of them was using a Ouija board. For a long time, we were very devoted to our Ouija board to bring through those spiritual messages. Because for one thing, it's very easy to be a blank slate with that tool. You have to understand it is a tool. And if you're using it as a spiritual tool in a sacred way, in a room that you have cleansed and charged and all that good stuff, it will work perfectly fine for you. And treat it like anything else. If for some reason, despite all that, you still have a bad experience, you cleanse that energy. And um, but what I found was that after using this for a certain amount of time, I was getting the messages before they came through. And at that point, the spirits got quite upset with us using the Ouija board. And one of them said, "Oh, this damn thing again." And at that point, we realized it must be put away. And they started to talk to me quite directly. And I've talked about how, as we moved more into that phase of things, I started seeing flowers opening in slow motion, like old stop motion photography, and other things that were exercises for opening those chakras, but I didn't know it then. Years later, when I found out that these were exercises that were quite formal in certain systems, it was a great confirmation to me of just how accurate those messages had been. Of course, at the time, it meant nothing to me. I just thought that was something they were using because it was easy to get that message through. But it was actually opening the chakra. Now, in the chat room, Calvin has said regarding ancestor offerings, you're absolutely correct. One of the best ways to keep someone's memory alive is to do something in their honor. Something that keeps them alive in your heart long after theirs has stopped beating. This is absolutely true. This is why we go out of our way to remember our ancestors, to let them know we want them in our lives, we want to have these relationships. And this has been part of human experience going back as far as we have written records. The Egyptians did exactly these same things. They made daily offerings to their ancestors. Now, some of their ideas were a little different because naturally our understanding grows over time. They had the idea that if they didn't make food offerings to their ancestors, the ancestors would starve. But I have always thought that was actually a symbolic way of saying that if you're not honoring your ancestors, they will basically go dormant within the soul. Not really starving per se, because that doesn't make any sense. They don't need physical food. But without our attention, they also don't need that particular face anymore. But as long as they are still part of our lives, they are our ancestors and they're to look after us. The Egyptian temples to the ancestors. In the case of pharaohs, they had full mortuary temples, but ordinary people did too, as long as they had enough money to afford them. And if they didn't have enough money to afford them, there was usually an altar in the house. And ancestors continued to be venerated as long as they were remembered. There's a saying that we use a lot in modern paganism, that which is remembered lives. This is kind of what it's referring to, that as long as we remember those who have gone ahead of us, a part of them is still involved with us, a part of them still exists. And my belief is that when they're not remembered anymore, that part of them probably goes dormant within the soul because nothing's interacting with it anymore. And hello to Jason in the chat room. It's good to see you, Jason. But it can come back if called. And I've seen that happen working with past lives. I mentioned the other day how surprised I was when I was told during a reading that I was doing that a past life can act the same as a spirit guide under certain circumstances. But yes, it can. And I have found that even in my own life since, that, if a past life had greater knowledge in some things than you have now, it can act as a guide to bring those things into your life. And it behaves just as any other spirit guide because it's the same part of the spirit that any spirit guide is using. It's the higher self. So even if they become forgotten for a time, they can still become active again. I think this is what's happened with many of those ancient Egyptian figures. I remember seeing a special on Nefertiti which talked about how having discovered her existence and speaking her name again had caused her to come back into existence in the afterlife. Well, I don't know that I exactly agree with that, but I believe that probably had been dormant for many centuries during which her name was not known, her life was not known. No one could think of her or call upon her. And so, although I wouldn't exactly call it coming back into activity, I think I would say is the better way to look at that. And I do think that's what's happened with some of these ancient people whose experiences and lives have become known again. I talked the other day about how I think the Egyptians would be very grateful for that because they wanted to be involved still in the world of the living. They wanted to be honored. They wanted to be remembered. Some of the most prominent ancient Egyptians are venerated as spiritual ancestors now because we deciphered hieroglyphics and found out who they were. One of the things you'll see sometimes in memes is that Cleopatra, the last independent pharaoh of Egypt, is closer in time to the invention of the iPhone than to the building of the pyramids, which is absolutely true. When we talk about Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid, we're talking about a very ancient time. The fact that we can talk about this now, he was never completely forgotten because the Greeks had written about him and we could still read Greek, but many aspects of his life were either forgotten or misrepresented. We can talk about Imhotep in great detail now, or certainly more detailed and formally about Himiunu, Amenhotep, son of Hapu, and many others. Unless I'm mistaken, the first named doctor in history was an Egyptian woman. I'm sure there are people who honor her as a spiritual ancestor of all healthcare people. And I think that this is something they would have wanted. I know, speaking for myself as someone who will one day become an ancestor and who was raised with the idea of ancestor veneration, I would want that. Because, my soul will go on to reincarnate. That will happen no matter what happens to the higher self of this life. If I remain very active as an ancestor for centuries, my soul will still go on and have many more incarnations. One of the things that one of the things I believe is that my soul has other incarnations while I'm living now. So incarnations are not chronological the way we think of. And so to be an ancestor doesn't interfere with that process at all. And one of the things you hear, and I believe is true, is that the work you do in this life to correct things like generational trauma also go back through all those previous lives. And I believe that's true. I believe that the work you do on your soul in this life affects all your previous lives and makes changes in some of those lives and makes additional timelines to them where those deficits did not exist. So I think all of the shadow work that you do is not only helping the current expression of your life, but many others too. Could be helping many ancestors that you have relationships who aren't necessarily previous incarnations of you, but are still affected by what you're doing. These are some of the aspects. Well, these are some of the aspects of how we as pagans look at death a little differently. And also what's involved in building a relationship with our ancestors. So I am expecting to continue this conversation next week. If you're not already aware, I have brought out my newest book, the Correllian Book of the Dead, for pre-order with an ETA of November 11. I want to thank the people who have already ordered it. As of this morning, there were 9. I know that we've sold several since then. And I thank you all. It's very gratifying to be selling a book again. And I want to talk a little more on this subject. And I'm also going to be publishing on my page some excerpts from the book. But if you're interested in that, you can find it at CorrellianPublishing.com, Correllian Book of the Dead, coming soon. And if you're wondering why I'm talking about this subject, this is why. So I want to thank everyone for being here. I love all of you. I love spending this time with you. I see that we've come to the end of our half hour. So I want to wish you a wonderful, happy day, and let us close with our prayer as we normally do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we pray that the things we do are also helpful to you. We know that we are incarnations of spirit, and that the things that we do in this world affect every incarnation of spirit. And so we hope that we do good things. We know that when we look at our ancestors, we're part of an ancestral line. We hope that we carry that forward honorably. Beloved ones, for all that you have prepared for us, we thank you, and we pray that we carry it forward well. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you. We know you're always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always also, and I will see you Monday.